course, it is the answers to the Q&A questions that I received. I asked quite a little while back if you had any questions about my vintage collecting. And so today I'm going to answer those questions. I thought I would show my outfit. This top on and this is a little glass blown cat. So let's just get started and I will answer the first question. So this question came from TikTok and somebody says, biggest question, how do you source your vintage dresses, trinkets, etc.? Are there specific places or brands you go for? Could you recommend some? If so, I've thought a lot about this question because it's actually a very sort of big question with a lot of answers to it. So I'm going to preface by saying that, and I'm sure everybody knows this obviously, no matter how much money even you have, I do think a certain amount of vintage collecting is luck. It's being at the right place, in the right time, either in person, actually in a physical place to buy an item, or online, just seeing the item at the right time before, somebody else does. I do think I would be lying if I said that luck never played a role. Sometimes, especially when I have bought through somewhere like Vinted, luck just has played a part in it, I've gotten amazing deals. I remember maybe about 4 months ago, I bought 4 1920s, 1930s and 1940s vintage compacts, some with their complete product, complete powder puff, basically never used, on Vinted for £15. And I was just lucky. I was lucky that somebody clearly wasn't interested in either researching or getting the full, amount that they could have done for those products. And I was lucky that I saw it before somebody else saw and purchased it. Luck just played a decent role in that. And then there's 2 pieces of advice about looking for things, this in particular, online. Obviously, if you've got a decent amount of money that you can spend, if money is not a huge question, then vintage will not be of any big particular issue to you. There is a fair amount of vintage stuff out there, and as long as you're sort of typing in the right things, which we'll get to in a minute, you can buy whatever you want. I think the big thing for me personally, especially when I was younger, it's not, I'm not saying that I go out and I spend ridiculous amounts of money, but I do now that I'm an adult with my own source of income. I'm not saying I spend a ridiculous amount ever, because I do still want to get things for less than their valued price, but I do now spend a little bit more. So when I was younger and didn't have a lot of money, I would spend hours on Vinted and on eBay, and obviously in America you have thrift stores, but we don't have anything like that over here. We have charity shops. So I would spend my free time when I wasn't studying going to charity shops and scouring them as well. I think if you're passionate about vintage and about collecting vintage on a budget, it really does not have to consume your life, but it's kind of like any other hobby, right? You dedicate time to it, and apart from gaming, vintage collecting really is my main hobby. I don't play a sport or do anything really very arty anymore. I used to a lot, and I'd like to get back into it. I used to knit a lot, but I haven't in quite a few years now. I haven't knitted since I graduated. biggest tip, which is annoying because it can take a long time. But if you're on a budget, I recommend not looking for specific things when you're searching. So, for example, one of the things that I most like to collect is vintage 20s and 30s guilloche compacts. If I were to type in 1920s, 1930s guilloche compact onto Vinted or onto eBay, you're going to be looking at people selling these compacts who know what they are, they know what they're worth, they know what they are, and you're going to be looking at probably paying much higher and much closer to what they on the higher end are worth than if you just on eBay and it's vintage compact and spend time trawling through probably a lot of not very good stuff to then maybe find that diamond in the rough. That's what I personally recommend doing if you're on a budget. Be very vague. Type in vintage compact, vintage dress, and that is my biggest tip. Be vague. You need to know, you need to have the research and the knowledge behind you to recognise the thing when you see it, to recognise, hey, this is from the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever era you're interested in collecting. So that's my other tip that hangs on that is do your research and know what you're looking for and know how to spot what you're looking for. But then if you're on a budget, be as vague as you possibly can with your searches. Vintage dress, vintage compact, and just trawl through. For eBay, I recommend putting the settings on of used item to make sure no new items, vintage inspired, come up. And then also select your sizes if it's clothing, so you're not getting stuff that's too small or too big for you. So there are filters you can go through to help a little bit, but I would say just be vague, because it's likely that the person listing it then doesn't know what it is and what it's worth, and especially if it's buy it now, you're more likely to get it for a much better price. Whenever I've gotten a really good deal on a vintage dress or compact, it's because it's been listed very vaguely and it's clear the person selling has no interest in knowing what it is and they just want to get a shot of it. If money isn't as big of an object, then I suppose be as specific as you like. I still think Vinted is an amazing source. Even if somebody knows what something's worth, it's highly unlikely they're going to be listing it for the maximum price on somewhere like Vinted. And yeah, I would spend time on eBay, just spend time getting to know what you want, and it does just take time searching. There's no magical website I can give you where there's tons of amazing vintage stuff for amazing prices. I think the hunt for me is what makes it fun and satisfying and rewarding. And if you are very passionate about wanting to start a collection, it is just time and dedication and research. In terms of specific brands, I don't have any specific brands that I tend to go for, particularly because very well-known brands are going to be very expensive, but also, back then a lot of brands are not household names today, I have dresses that have brands in them, but I don't think I have any double pieces, like, I have all of this from the same brand kind of thing. Most of my vintage dresses from the 40s and 50s do not have labels in at all. The ones that do, I've tried looking the companies up to no avail. St. Michael is a great one for vintage, like lingerie pieces, bed jackets, that kind of thing. But yeah, annoyingly I can't be a huge help on the brand side of things, because often I only have one piece from a brand and I think it's unlikely I'll come across another, you know what I mean? So I do have clothing items that have a brand attached to them. But again, I think you're probably narrowing it down too much if you're looking for a specific brand, because again, I've had items of clothing where they've listed it and not listed it under the brand name, which I think is quite common if slash consume movies, music, books, etc. So I know that I have mentioned this before, I'm a film graduate, so I did film for my degree. So I'm very passionate about film. But I'm also with movies, with books, with film, with television. I'm a creature of habit. I think because during my film degree I spent, many years watching up to 5 new films a week, I did kind of get burnt out of that and started just sort of going back to reconsuming my old favourites again and again and again. And I'm very guilty of doing that. You would have thought, and it should be the case, that since finishing my film degree, I should be much more inspired to watch more different kinds of film. But I do find, especially after a long day at work or just a busy day in general, I just want to sit down and not have to pay much attention. I'm very guilty of that, and I just want to watch something that I know I will enjoy and that I don't have to follow too much because I know what's going to happen. That's what I do a lot of. Obviously, I'm sure it's of no surprise to anybody that I love old film, 30s, 40s, 50s, Hollywood film. I absolutely love anything with Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe, Hedy Lamarr, Jean Tierney. I just adore the fashion so much. I think I could watch the technically most worst film ever if the fashion was gorgeous. That's the other thing I would say. Content and what it actually is, of course, means a lot to me, but I would say I'm split 50-50 between wanting to watch something that is well written and engaging, but also wanting to watch something that is very visually beautiful. And I think the 50s and 40s films have a lot of that style and substance. I do, and I will enjoy watching a film just with substance, but it won't become my favourite if I don't like the style. I would say something that has combined that's been created in recent years better than anything. Probably, I would say my favourite TV show of the past 10 years has been The Great with Nicholas Hoult and Elle Fanning, which is a very historically inaccurate retelling of Catherine the Great's rise to power in Russia and the coup over her husband, Peter. I just think that it's brilliantly written. I love something that's very dramatic but that has humour, and if it's dark humour, even better. And this show is like that. Dark humour, very funny, very dramatic, very well written, funny, so funny, but it's gorgeous. The costuming, the setting, it's so friggin' beautiful. It's so beautiful to watch. That's just like the cherry on top. That's what completes it for me, is that it's so beautiful. There have been shows that I've thoroughly enjoyed, but I don't think it will get up there for me in the best of the best if I don't like the style and if I don't think it's beautiful to look at, which perhaps is incredibly vain of me, but I can't help it. I'm such a visual person. I do gravitate towards a very specific stylized look that I enjoy in film and television. Some of my favourite films are Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, Leave Her to Heaven with Jean Tierney. I just think it's a feast for the eyes. I adore 1940s Technicolor. I just think there's something so uniquely beautiful about 40s Technicolor. I dislike very, very highly, and I'm sure this will be a controversial opinion, modern day musicals. I have no interest really in musicals whatsoever. Again, the only reason I really like old musicals are because they're songs that I enjoy. It's a style that I enjoy, and there's actors and actresses in it that I enjoy. But actually, if 99% of even old musicals you said will take most of the singing out and just make it a normal film, I'd go, okay, I'm fine with that. Which is so bad, I know. There are some musicals that I thoroughly do genuinely really enjoy. I love Meet Me in St. Louis, one of my favourites. I love Funny Face. That's why I like old musicals, because if it's Frank Sinatra singing, oh my gosh, I'm here for it. I'm down for it. Stop the movie, let me listen to Frank Sinatra or Grace Kelly or Audrey Hepburn or Marilyn. But modern musicals have nothing to offer me. I can't think of anything worse than watching Mamma Mia or The Greatest Showman. And, you know, I'm not saying that I don't see the appeal of those films, and I'm not trying to, you know, single people out who enjoy them. There's nothing wrong with that. I just don't get it. I don't get any enjoyment out of it. I'm sorry. I just don't. I suppose it's so hard to talk about what I like without then going into what I dislike. I'm not a superhero fan. I don't get it. I really, really don't get it. And again, I think the visual aspect of that has a lot to do with it. There's nobody in beautiful scenery and beautiful costuming. So, yeah, it just... superheroes and most sci-fi, really. Sci-fi horror, I enjoy. It just doesn't appeal to me because the settings and the stories just don't really reach me very much. So yeah, like a rom-com when it's done well. When Harry Met Sally, one of my favourite films ever. I love that film. It's one of those things when somebody says, "What do you like?" and your mind goes blank and you think, what do I like? In terms of books, I love a good horror book. I don't like super fast-paced horror, and I think Stephen King, I love Stephen King, but I think he's very Marmite. I know some people that have said they can't read Stephen King because he takes too long to get into it, and they want something that sort of is scaring them and giving them those hits from the second they start reading, which I understand. But for me, Stephen King takes a long time to build things up and to set the scene and to set the characters, and then all hell breaks loose and it unravels, and the way that he does it for me is just so satisfying and makes it so much creepier and scarier than anything else. The last book of his I read was The Tommyknockers, which actually I suppose is quite sci-fi, but I really enjoyed it. It's funny because he says it's one of his least favourite books he's ever written. I believe he was very much in his addiction when he wrote that book, so I suppose he views it through a different lens. He says that he thinks that there's only half a book really in there. I think he says somewhere in there there's a good book, but it's far too long. And a lot of his books are very long. Needful Things is one of my favourite books of all time, and that's a very, very long book. I also love Agatha Christie, and the TV show of Poirot starring David Suchet is probably one of my most consumed comfort things. I love Agatha Christie books. I have a very, very vast collection of them, pretty exclusively all vintage. I love the classics. I love Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I love Pride and Prejudice. I love Jane Eyre. I love David Copperfield. I would probably say my favourite book of all time is I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. I just think it's a beautiful book. I love it. Hang on. My very old cat's just come in. Let's see if he will show himself. Very loud. He's always been a loud talker, but since he's gotten older, he's gotten a lot more vocal. I wonder if you can hear him purring. Probably. I love the Anne of Green Gables series very, very much as well. Some of my favourite book series ever. Let's see if he'll come and say hello. He's 15, so he's an old boy. He's been with me for a very, very long time. I'm trying to think what else. I love Terry Pratchett's books as well. I like fantasy when it's done. I'm quite particular about the fantasy I enjoy, but I love Terry Pratchett. Mort is one of my favourite books of all time. It has one of my favourite premises of all time. I just think it's genius. If you don't know what Mort is about, it is a boy who becomes the apprentice to death. The personification of death that Terry Pratchett does is probably my favourite literary character of all time. He loves cats, and in the book he decides that he's not sure he wants to be death anymore, and he leaves Mort, his apprentice, to take over, and he goes and he works as a cook in a kitchen. And he goes and he makes breakfast for people because he thinks he doesn't want to be death anymore. It's such a good book, so I love that. I really recommend all of his Discworld stuff. All of his books are very good. I'm trying to think what else. I love a good autobiography. My favourite autobiography of all time, I've read it 3 times, and listened to the audiobook once, which is also very good, is Bob Mortimer's autobiography. He's a British comedian, if you don't know who he is. He's very funny. He's kind of had a crazy life, with a lot of funny events happen, but at its core it's also about his struggle with shyness and being shy and trying to overcome that, which he discusses very beautifully, actually, and I just think it's a lovely read. So I do enjoy a good autobiography as well. Music is a huge one for me. I've grown up with parents who've always had, I'm going to call it eclectic, but I think it's actually, which is a nice thing, becoming less and less so, you know. I've never grown up with parents who have listened to what's been on, you know, in the charts, or really very mainstream, I suppose. That doesn't mean I don't have aspects of more like poppy mainstream music that I don't enjoy. I am planning on filming a vinyl collection soon, and I suppose that will give a better idea of the kind of music that I like. I do think my tastes are quite varied, actually. I'll just try and rattle off some people that I enjoy. I love Kate Bush. I love Stevie Nicks. I love Lana Del Rey. I love Fiona Apple. Blondie. David Bowie. Prince. I love Nick Cave. The Red Hot Chili Peppers. Fleetwood Mac. Jeff Buckley. I love The Cure and The Smiths. In terms of like older music, I love Nat King Cole. I love Frank Sinatra. Bing Crosby. I love Ella Fitzgerald. I also think I have, because of film and TV, plenty of artists that I love one song of, and I'm really bad and I've just never gone to look at their whole discography. Gilmore Girls is a show I've been watching since I was maybe about 9 years old, and that brought me up on very good music. I think it's very good music. I was about 9 when I first heard and fell in love with Mazzy Star, somebody else that I love. So yeah, that's the kind of music that I like. Sure, I've missed out hundreds of artists. I'll kick myself later. So the next question is asking about advice for cleaning a vintage plastic doll. I'm probably not going to be very much help with that, because vintage dolls are not something that I really collect. I buy the 60s, 70s Cindy dolls when I see them out, because they were my mother's childhood doll. So I collect them for her when I see them. If it's felt tip and marker, then I know that there are certain ways that you could try and lighten it back out. I really would recommend going on a forum. There's lots of forums for this kind of thing, even Reddit, and asking about something like that. If it's something that's not too crazy, I really recommend a magic eraser to start off with, because they're pretty good at getting stuff off. And I would say if the magic eraser doesn't do anything, maybe go into a forum and maybe put pictures of what the doll looks like. I'm sorry I couldn't be more help, but yeah, I don't really deal with vintage dolls, and most of the plastic things that I've had, it's mostly been like dirt rather than proper like stains or marks that I've had to get out. So somebody's asked, how do I store delicate items? Delicate trinkets are pretty much always on display, so I don't really have anything packed away. Everything because that's how you get sun damage and sun fading. I always try to go careful with that. Storing delicate clothing. I have, and if you follow me on TikTok you would have seen this, I have a separate rail, an open rail, not in my wardrobe, where I store my vintage delicate pieces. That way I'm not, when I'm constantly going in and out and hanging stuff up, I'm not constantly brushing them, they've not got clothes, compressing them either side. So that's how I like to store my vintage clothing, so that it just sort of is allowed to hang by itself, and it's not being crushed or squashed, and I'm not constantly batting it about, basically. So somebody has said, what's your favourite category of vintage item you like to collect? Vintage beauty items. I would have to say vintage beauty items, and if I was to be forced to narrow that down, probably 30s and 40s guilloche compacts are my favourite things to collect. But yeah, as a wider type, vintage beauty, so vintage sets, vintage mirrors, vintage compacts, actual vintage makeup and packaging, and yeah, and then I would say vintage magazines and that kind of thing come very close after. But yeah, vintage beauty items, probably my favourite, and I guess fashion and clothing as well. The next question is, what got you into vintage collecting? What is your favourite item in your collection? So my mum really got me into vintage collecting, because the things that I'm interested in and the things that I like are basically identical to her, and I grew up in a household that literally looks the way that I now choose to decorate my spaces. We've just got very, very similar tastes, and so I grew up with my mother going to charity shops and second-hand stores and constantly collecting little vintage trinkets, so yeah, and then I suppose also her love and introduction to me at a very young age of vintage film as well, and so I grew up watching all these beautiful women and from the 40s and 50s, so I watched those films from a very young age, and I'm sure that influenced me a lot too. So yeah, that's probably why. And then obviously the second part to that was, what's your favourite item in your collection? My vanity set, that I have shown or will be showing in a video, depending when this comes out, was something that had always been on my wish list, and I'm incredibly happy to own that. One of my guilloche compacts probably as well. I do really, really love vintage family items as well, so I've got some compacts that were my great-grandmother that mean a lot to me. But it's weekly, it will change. That's such a hard question to answer. So the next question is, are there any types of vintage items that you don't particularly like / don't like collecting? I've thought a lot about my answer to this one, and it's quite tricky because it's kind of one of those things where if I don't collect it, I might kind of forget that it's a thing that you can collect and that people do collect, if that makes sense. Like, whenever I go to a car boot here in the UK, whatever one I go to, there's always somebody selling vintage model cars. I have no interest at all in vintage model cars, so I suppose that's something. I'm not really interested in like vintage war collecting. People collect a lot of militant things and that kind of thing. I'm trying to just think of areas that I really have no interest in the collection of. So yeah, I suppose war memorabilia I'm not hugely interested in, but then again I love the 40s, so it's so tricky because until somebody says, oh, I collect this, and I think, oh, that's not something I'd personally like to collect, I just can't I can't really think. I'm trying to think of sort of general categories that I'm not overly interested. I suppose people do collect like vintage tools and that kind of thing. I'm also not interested in that. Yeah, it's hard really to pinpoint. Somebody would probably have to list me off all the different things, vintage things you could collect, and I'd have to find the ones I'm not interested in. But I am pretty broad in what I enjoy collecting, because I just like to furnish my whole house, like it. So yeah. So the next question you had to choose one item in your collection you are most proud of obtaining, what is it and how did you acquire it? Or if you have a dream item you hope to acquire one day. I'm actually pretty lucky in a lot of my dream items I have managed to acquire throughout the years, like my vintage vanity set, a lot of the guilloche compacts. I'm desperate for a guilloche compact with a finger ring. Obviously the ladies, the flappers in the 20s would go out dancing and put it on their finger so they wouldn't lose their compact. I do have one with a chain around it so it can go around your wrist, but I would love one with the finger ring. I'm sure there's so much that I would love that I can't even think of it right now. It's proud of obtaining. That's interesting. Some of the compacts that I found through Vinted I'm incredibly proud of. The one with the spider on it that you guys have seen before, I got that for like £5 on Vinted. I think that's quite rare. Was very chuffed to get that. My compact that blew up on TikTok with the lighter on it, I got that for £70 on eBay, which I thought was a steal. I was incredibly excited. Yeah, I suppose if it's a rare item and I got it for a good price, and I'm quite proud to own that. Own items like that. A lot of my vintage Japanese Hollywood magazines I feel quite pleased with to own, because obviously they're not very common over here. So another question is, when did you start collecting, and what do you consider the first item in your collection? Again, because I grew up around somebody who vintage collected, it's really hard to know. I know by the age of about 7 there was an antique store that I used to go to with my mother, and we knew the woman who ran it fairly well, and I had decided that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to run an antique store, and so she would give me sort of like broken plates and discount things for cheap. And I remember coming home one day and putting it all out together, putting price tags on it and saying it was my vintage store. I did give it a name, my vintage shop. I can't remember what it was now. So yeah, it's really hard for me to say what my first vintage item was, because I have always had something pretty much that's been vintage or antique. Yeah, because I've been doing it for so long, it wasn't sort of a conscious decision as a teenager or as an adult to start buying vintage, and there's one thing that got me started on it, if that makes sense. I lost the actual original copy of this final question, but somebody was asking what decades I was most interested in. So definitely 30s, 40s, 50s. I do like the 20s as well. I just love the clothes and just the general style of the time. As you get into the 60s, I do still like a lot of it. I like the shorter skirts and that kind of thing. I don't always love the prints, you know, they were much bolder and brighter prints in the 60s, and that's not so much my vibe. When it comes to the 70s, what always happens is I adore the prints and I adore the styles, but they're always too loose and flowy. Often for my taste I like something that's quite fitted. 80s is really not my vibe at all. I don't like the silhouettes very